Welcome to Tulsa, Oklahoma, the state's second largest city and home to almost 400,000 Oklahomans. Tulsa is a bustling regional hub for the arts, entertainment, and business, with towering skyscrapers and beautiful architecture. Anyone who comes to Tulsa can't deny its beauty. But this city isn't all it seems. Its origins are stained from the tragic events of one night in the early 1920s. A night that left 36 blocks of Tulsa in rubble. A night known as the Tulsa Race Riot.
I honestly have no knowledge of what the Tulsa race riots are.
Growing up in Oklahoma City, I had heard of the race riots a couple of times, but they didn't teach us anything about them in school, even in high school. And then I took Oklahoma history here at OSU, and they didn't teach us anything about it then either. So honestly, I don't know a lot about the Tulsa race riots. I just know that it was a pretty big deal, and it wasn't really great, and some bad stuff happened, but I don't know any specifics about it.
I know that it was really bad. A lot of people died, and that's about it.
I remember studying about them a little bit in high school and a little bit in elementary school.
Obviously they were in Tulsa. They were during the civil rights movement. I know a lot of it had to do with racial tensions, where African Americans were not being treated properly or anything of that like. Otherwise, not too much.
It has never been the same since the riot. They've tried to build it up. There are a few nice things down there, a few landmarks, but it's nothing like it should be.
The 1921 Tulsa Race Riot happens in a period of American history that a lot of historians and sociologists call the nadir of race relations in America, the low point of race relations in America, because this is right after the end of World War I, so a lot of African American soldiers who had fought overseas in World War I defending the country came back to essentially second-class citizenship, so they were frustrated. There were so-called race riots around the country. These are mainly assaults on black communities rather than race riots. Race riot sounds like a sort of a balanced, even-handed kind of social conflict. That's not what these were. The 1920s were also a time when the Ku Klux Klan, one of the premier domestic terroristic organizations in the United States, was growing and blossoming in Oklahoma specifically, particularly in the late 1920s. So you have all this sort of racial tumult and turmoil going on in the United States generally. Tulsa begins to come into its own as the oil capital of the world after the discovery of the Glen Pool in the early 1900s. A lot of prosperity here in Tulsa, and there was actually a lot of black wealth relative to other places in the country, in part because a number of the pioneers who founded the Greenwood community, the black section of Tulsa, had connections to Native Americans, particularly the Muskogee Creek freedmen people, were people who owned land and started businesses down in the Greenwood community. So you have this sort of contrast. On the one hand, African Americans perceived by many whites as second-class citizens, and on the other hand, a group of relatively prosperous, successful African Americans living in Tulsa right across the tracks, the Frisco tracks from the white community, which is a formula, clearly, for disaster.
It all started with an elevator riot in the Drexel building, a department store in downtown Tulsa. A black man by the name of Dick Rowland worked as a shoe shiner nearby. Whenever he had used the bathroom, he had to take the elevator to the top floor of the Drexel building because that was the closest black restroom. He was permitted to ride the elevator by the building's owner, which usually had a young female elevator operator. On May 30th, a young white woman by the name of Sarah Page was working the elevator. When the elevator returned to the ground floor, a nearby store clerk heard Page cry out, and he turned in time to see Rowland running out of the building. The witnesses' accounts brought up many theories as to why Paige was screaming. Some believed that the two were having a secret affair which resulted in an argument on the elevator. But the most likely theory is that the elevator jolted, causing Roland to trip and accidentally grab onto Paige. However, what the authorities thought at the time was that Roland had assaulted her while they were alone together in the elevator. An arrest warrant for Dick Rowland was immediately issued. Within hours, the Tulsa Tribune had published a story detailing Rowland's alleged assault on the young Miss Paige. By the time Rowland was found and arrested that evening, murmurs of lynching was spreading through the town like wildfire. In the hours following Rowland's arrest, a violent mob of white Tulsans surrounded the courthouse where Rowland was being held, their rage boiling. By 10 p.m., the mob had expanded to a size of more than 2,000. When 75 black men arrived at the courthouse to defend Rowland, some members of the mob couldn't contain their dis-ease any longer. A white man and a black man wrestled over one of the guns the black group had brought, causing it to discharge into the air. The crowd dispersed. White Tulsans began gathering guns, tools, anything they could find, and began the march toward Greenwood.
The Greenwood district was different in that it represented kind of coming together of a critical mass of black entrepreneurs. So most of the businesses in Greenwood were mom and pop type operations or service organizations. So there was a collection of lawyers and doctors and pharmacists, businesses like movie theaters and dance halls, barbershops, beauty salons, grocery stores, all manner of small businesses right on Greenwood Avenue and in that community. And that was different, again, because of the hub aspect of it, the coming together of so many businesses, and the idea that anything was possible in the Greenwood district in Tulsa.
As the mob approached Greenwood, they looted pawn shops and hardware stores for weapons. Some families sought shelter in Greenwood's churches and community centers, hoping to wait out the turmoil. As the white mob approached the Greenwood district, the violence was most concentrated near the intersection of Greenwood Avenue and Archer Street, as black and white Tulsans shot at one another across the nearby train tracks.
The resistance was relatively short-lived because they were outnumbered and outgunned, and whites had looted pawn shops and so forth. The police really were derelict in their duty, didn't provide any protection for the Greenwood community. And in fact, some of the people in the mob that invaded the Greenwood community were actually deputized by the local police. So it was a no-win situation for the Greenwood community.
As the fighting wore on, the white mob broke through into the heart of Greenwood. The mob looted, ransacked, and set everything in sight to the torch. One account stated that the deputized white men dragged a man out into the street, beat him to death, and then drug his corpse through the streets for hours on end. Entire families were uprooted and driven out of the city in just a matter of hours. Many never returned, and their belongings were left burning in the streets. The Mount Zion Church could be seen burning from every corner of Greenwood, the final sign that the district and city had fallen under mob rule. When word of the full-blown riot reached Governor James Robertson in Oklahoma City, he'd immediately dispatched the National Guard from the capital. Thankfully, Governor Robertson had put the National Guard on standby when rumors of racial tension had arrived in Oklahoma City earlier that day, so the units were able to leave by train almost immediately. When the National Guard arrived, martial law was declared and all rioting was put to an end. The Guard set up headquarters in Tulsa and began sorting out events from the chaos and horror of the riot.
Many African American citizens, primarily men, are interned, very much like people of Japanese ancestry were interned during World War II. They're taken to these camps throughout the city, including at the fairgrounds, for example, at McNulty Park, ostensibly for their own safekeeping, but really what it did was leave the Greenwood community relatively defenseless, with mostly women and children occupying the community. The Red Cross set up a number of shelters and hospitals. Booker T. Washington High School was converted to a makeshift hospital. So many African Americans spent days, weeks, months, even up to a year, living in these tent cities that were established by the Red Cross.
By September of that very same year, all charges against Dick Rowland were dropped, and Sarah Page melted into the background of people's minds. All that was left of Greenwood were a few buildings and smoldering foundations of the once proud Black Wall Street. Although Greenwood may never return to its former self, the community has progressed. Businesses, restaurants, churches, schools, a university, and even a minor league baseball team all reside in the Greenwood district. Many Tulsans are familiar with the area, but for what it is today, not what it was in 1921. Racism is alive today in the United States, but in a different form. Racial slurs are thrown around without any recognition of the true meaning and hurt it is imposing upon people of all races.
My experience with discrimination today probably isn't as blatant as it was like for my mother, father, and like my parents and things like that. Really, growing up in Oklahoma, I've experienced discrimination subtly. I personally think that since it's America is like a politically correct country, and once it became not politically correct to discriminate against African Americans or minorities in general, that racism kind of just took like a back burner. And so it's just subtle things like maybe a look or a comment, a snide comment like, you want some Kool-Aid or some it's just something like just something as simple as that, which it's kind of, I don't like to play any race cards, so I usually let it slide, but I feel like people can, you can kind of infer feelings and the way things are said from people or by people, and that's the only really form of discrimination I had.
The type of discrimination that is occurring today is more by the words people use and less by their actions. Only recently have we seen an incline in forceful racial discrimination. Many people believe that these acts could be prevented if the proper time were taken to learn about past events like the Tulsa race riot.
Unfortunately, one of our great failures is to study and learn from our history so that we don't repeat the same mistakes. And that's playing itself out today in a lot of things that are happening that we see in the news. So I think we are a people who are attuned to instantaneous gratification. And so when it comes to really complex problems like human relations problems, which are race relations problems, what we really want is to identify a problem, have a solution, and move on to the next problem. But that's not the way it works in human relations or race relations. You identify the problem, and you work on the problem, and you work on the problem, and you work on the problem, and you keep working on the problem. Because it doesn't go away. You're bringing new people into the cycle, you're educating new people all the time. So it's a process. It's an ongoing process. It's a never-ending process. I think some people get frustrated with that. And they sort of believe that there should be some sort of endpoint. Why do we have to keep talking about race? Well, we have to keep talking about it because it's always relevant, and there are always issues, and there are always people to be educated, and relationships to be improved.
But how do we educate others when acts like the Tulsa race riot aren't always found in high school history courses? Many aren't exposed to the terrible acts of 1921 until college, and even then they do not understand the severity of the racial discrimination. Although the riot occurred in 1921 and integration in 1964, there is still widespread discrimination in our state and nation. Despite the current buzz in media, many acts of discrimination go unseen and unheard. It is on the shoulders of Oklahomans today to educate the new generations about our state's history, the good and the bad. It's part of Oklahoma and each Oklahoman. By knowing the past, future discrimination and pain can be prevented, and Oklahoma can begin to rebuild, starting, of course, in Greenwood.